Yeah, thank you, Grace. So my name is Dr. Anne Theunissen, and I'm a research officer at the TII at LSE. And I would like to talk to you today about the lived experiences of transgender and or non-binary workers in workplaces in the UK. This is a study that I'm working on together with Dr. Grace Lorden. And it's basically part of a bigger research project. So we were interested in getting a better understanding of the barriers to personal productivity that workers in the UK experience. And it's a big qualitative study based on nearly 200 interviews with professionals in different sectors in the UK. And we talked to different groups, Asian and Black women, workers with LGBT identities, transgender and non-binary workers, workers who are diagnosed with mental health conditions, workers who are disabled by society, neurodivergent workers, and white men and women stratified by socioeconomic status. The aims of this broader study were, first of all, to get a better understanding of the experience of these diverse workers. So to get to know what are the enablers and barriers to their productivity. And second, to identify concrete actions that workplaces and organizations can take to help them to be more productive. So we have now collected all of this data and we're working on different papers. So in the first paper, it basically covers all of these social identity groups and their perspectives and lived experiences with respect to productivity. And if you're interested in hearing more about the results of that paper, I suggest that you stay in touch with us. So you can look at the TII website, and also if you're thinking that it might be interesting for your own organization, for us to do research and to also do recommendations for how you can help your workplace to become more inclusive, you can always get in touch with us at tii@lse.ac.uk. But I also would like to talk to you today about the second paper we're working on, which is specifically focusing on transgender and non-binary workers in the UK. And we thought it was particularly important to write this paper because there's actually very limited academic literature available on this particular group. So when we're looking at the existing academic literature, which is quite a small body of literature on transgender and or non-binary workers in organizations, we see that several broader themes have been explored. So first of all, authors have explored the discrimination and high levels of unemployment with which this group is confronted. And they have illustrated how transgender and or non-binary workers can be confronted with very specific forms of discrimination and microaggressions in the workplace simply because they don't fit the sort of like cisgender experience or the gender binary experience. But also they have illustrated that transgender workers, some of whom undergo a transition, might after that transition also be confronted with the types of discrimination that cisgender women are confronted with. So yeah, they are basically confronted with different forms of discrimination. There's another body of another branch of this literature that has focused on the coping mechanisms of transgender and non-binary workers in relation to transphobia in the workplace. Authors have also illustrated how these workers might then revert to coping mechanisms such as isolating themselves or trying to get powerful positions and only then coming out in the workplace. And then there's a last branch of the literature that has explored the effectiveness, or rather the ineffectiveness, of existing ED&I and diversity management practices. And it also emphasizes that most of what organizations do today, and this research predominantly focuses on the global north, organizations in Europe and in the US, they have illustrated that most of these practices are not sufficient to address the specific needs of the transgender and non-binary community. So overall, what we know from the literature is that we see that the specific lived experience of transgender and non-binary workers is is strongly influenced by the interactions they have with colleagues at work and by the relations with their colleagues and the workplace practices that are implemented. However, we don't know yet how this affects their productivity, so that's what we're focusing on in this study. So the aim of the study is to explore how transgender and non-binary workers perceive their individual productivity in relation to these workplace practices and interactions. And we based this study on 19 interviews with 10 transgender workers and 10 non-binary workers, because sometimes these categories overlap. Not all transgender workers identify themselves along the gender binary. And the research question that we are addressing is, how do transgender and non-binary workers see this relation between workplace interactions and practices and their individual productivity? So when looking at the data, when looking at the interviews, we did a preliminary data analysis, and we found that these workers were typically talking about two different types of individual productivity. So first of all, generic job productivity, which basically means as much as just doing your actual job and getting your tasks done. But then they also talked about what we interpreted as gender minority specific forms of productivity. And I will show you a little bit later in this presentation what this actually entails. And we also identified 3 different productivity narratives. So first of all, workers talked about inclusive workplace practices and interactions as something that boosted their individual productivity. And on the other hand, they also talked about how exclusionary workplace practices and interactions could undermine their individual productivity. And then lastly, the last productivity narrative that we found is about the way in which how managing workplace interactions and practices is actually a form of gender minority specific productivity in itself. And I would like to now show you some of the quotes to show you some of the data that people talked about in the interviews with us. So first of all, when we're looking at this narrative about inclusive workplaces help workers to be more productive when it comes to their generic job productivity, several of the people we talked to basically said that when they felt that they could be themselves at work, they could simply do their job better. So for example, this non-binary worker talked to me about how they, in their current job, before they actually started the job, they already asked whether it was possible that people in the organization would use their pronouns. And they actually said, I do not want to be somewhere where I will not be fully accepted. If I can't be fully me and bring myself to work, I'm not going to bring my best, because the more I can be me, the better I can do my job. So this basically illustrates this narrative that inclusive workplaces are good for individual productivity. Then there was also this narrative that exclusion undermines generic job productivity. So for example, this transgender worker said that when she was not out in the workplace as transgender, she was constantly having to lie to her colleagues. And she said, I was having to think about the version of the truth that I was telling them. And that took a lot of energy. And I was constantly having to remember the stories I told as well. So there was always something pulling my attention. So I couldn't just focus on my work. So this also, again, illustrates that not being able to be yourself and not being able to show to your colleagues who you really are, that's also undermining how well you can do your job. Now I would like to move to the third narrative. So this idea that managing workplace interactions and practices is a form of productivity that's specific to gender minorities in the workplace. And there are several sort of like types of this form of productivity that I would like to show you today. So for example, this transgender man talked about when he was coming out at work and talked to his manager. This manager basically said, okay, I would like to send you to an occupational health therapist to see what is recommended for you to best support you at work. And this occupational health professionals that he should only come in the office once a week because it's better for his well-being. And then basically this manager was immediately trying to find ways out of this arrangement. And so this respondent said it's almost a year later and we're still fighting about it. So it sort of like illustrates the extra work and the energy that this transgender professional has to put into this arrangement with his manager, which is interpreted in this study as an extra form of productivity that is demanded from them. Then another example of a gender minority specific form of productivity is presenting yourself in relation to colleagues in the workplace. So this transgender woman shared, when I'm going to the office, I will always make sure that I've put on makeup and that my hair doesn't look like crap. And if I have a cold, like a sore throat, that makes it a lot harder to keep my voice. In the office, everybody knows that I'm a trans woman, and so it does feel like I should be trying to meet whatever that societal expectation of a trans woman is. So this also illustrates that she's putting a lot of work into simply presenting herself, and she feels this pressure that in interactions with colleagues she has to sort of like uphold this image of what is sort of like what she feels is expected of her to even be accepted as a real transgender woman at work. And then something that also various respondents talked about is the way in which the initiatives that are organized in the workplace to support the transgender and non-binary community, that most of these initiatives are typically organized by the community themselves. So this non-binary worker said it's the LGBT plus community themselves who are putting together events and having network chats and organize the trans, non-binary and gender non-conforming meetings every month. That's entirely voluntary, done by us. So that's again an additional form of productivity that this group engages in. And then the last example that I would like to share with you today is about these interactions in the workplace and when workers get misgendered by colleagues or by other people they interact with for their job. So this non-binary transgender worker said, I'll still get misgendered. I'm on a call with an engineer and I will get referred to with the wrong pronouns. I can find it quite dysregulating. I think I don't want it to affect me as much as it does. And then that just adds to it, right? Like in the kind of combat inside me, like no, it's fine, or actually no, it's probably not. Because they told me that they have to make an assessment whenever this misgendering happens, whether they actually take on the burden of educating the other person about pronouns, telling them, no, actually you should call me this or that, and then, or if they decide to just let it go, but then having to cope with the consequences of actually, you know, this form of a microaggression of being misgendered at work. So that's also an extra type of work that is sort of like put on their shoulders to have to educate other people about using pronouns. So that was just an overview of some of the findings of this study. I would now like to reflect upon the practical implications. So first of all, I think we can see that, especially with respect to the first two narratives that we identified about inclusive workplaces as being boosting individual productivity and exclusive workplaces as undermining individual productivity, this very much aligns with the business case for diversity, which state that diversity is good for business. But then when we're also looking at the third narrative that we identified about this gender minority specific form of productivity, I think it's really important that organizations recognize this extra work that is done by the gender minority community, and that it might be a good idea to be more reflexive about different ways to more equally distribute this workload among the entire workforce, and to not only make this the responsibility of the gender minority community. And we've seen in other work that we've been doing that this is also, this similar type of dynamics are also visible, for example, for people who are disabled by society or for other minority groups in the workplace. So yeah, these are just some reflections to finish with. And yeah, thank you very much for listening. I would love to hear some of your questions. And in any case, you can always contact us also on this email address. Yeah.
You might not have gone to this point yet, but are there any suggestions for how to raise the awareness in a company that goes beyond just sort of like a tick box generalized training course? Because I think that's often what happens with ED&I is you do like a mandatory training course, but like, is there a way to make sure that actually, you know, embeds into the company?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's true that we haven't developed this that far yet. But I think it's first of all really important to understand the lived experiences of these workers, right? Because I think that a lot of these quotes and the fact that we have this finding that they have this additional form of productivity, it's already crucial that organizations are aware of that. And only when they know what the lived experiences are, only then you can start working on concrete actions and how to improve things in the workplace. And I think, some of the quotes that we have seen, for example, the fact that it's usually the gender minority community themselves organizing the support initiatives. I think organizations can already start thinking about ways to actually ask other workers as well to help organize these things and to involve more people. And I also think, for example, the quote about the being misgendered is also something that organizations actually should work on, because it's very much a relational interaction that's going on there, where there's clearly different people involved. It's not just this gender minority community. So I think that being aware of these aspects and these dynamics is the first step in the directions of concrete actions. But we will certainly work on this further down the line. And as I said, please keep an eye on our website, because we will definitely write about that later on. Thank you. Yeah.
Probably possibly more of an observation. Going back to the example where the individual stated their pronouns and then said, "Are you okay with that? Because I only want to work with individuals who respect that." So I work for Aviva. So pronouns are everywhere that you choose to. So it's on your email, it's on your Teams, it's on your name badge. So our view is that you then present that, and then that's it said. I just felt that could end up going down an interactive route that would be, unhelpful depending on who was on the call. To demand confirmation of the pronouns rather than to just present them was something I've not seen. So that was one thing just to know. And then the other one was there seemed to be a bit of a correlation about office attendance and whether someone should go into the office or not. And I would worry a bit about putting, just because again you wouldn't want somebody sidelined or marginalised for not being in the office, and therefore for us our view is you'll be in the office unless there's a workplace adjustment passport that you need, and therefore it would be a diversity characteristic that would take somebody out. It would be more a practical need.
Yes. So with respect to that last point, I think it's sort of like interesting to reflect upon, because if you compare, for example, this gender minority community to people who are disabled by society, like people with a disability, I guess there might be a tendency to think, okay, because there's like this obligation to do reasonable accommodations for people with a disability, right? And there's still this way of thinking about the transgender community as somehow less entitled to accommodations. But I think what's also important to understand is also when talking to this community, many of them said it's not just what happens in the workplace, it's also what happens on your commute to work. And there is, especially for some of them who are going through a transition, there's also like a lot of like physical pain sometimes that they're going through that makes it difficult for them sometimes to physically go to their workplace. So I think it's important to sort of like understand that, this community is sometimes entitled to specific accommodations, and especially like in the example here where a occupational therapist recommends these special accommodations. I think it's key to start thinking of this community as equally entitled to reasonable adjustments as, for example, the disabled people in the workplace. So I think it's important to understand that that's something that sometimes this group, this social identity group, simply needs. At the same time, I also think it's key that in the workplace they are really felt welcome and accepted. And I think it's great to hear also what your organization is doing with respect to the pronouns. I think now when answering your second question, I forgot what your first one was. Sorry.
It was more of a comment. It was
Okay.
more to say to somebody, those are my pronouns, are you
Yes.
okay with that? I'm sitting there thinking of a work environment. I think that might, end up derailing rather than just, these are my pronouns, that's it.
Yes. Okay, I see.
But so it's more of a
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that comment. Yeah.
Thank you. It's really interesting. I'm just trying to think from, say, kind of like skeptical managers or skeptical managerial boards that, they might kind of like keep the EDI talk somewhere there in a very superficial manner, but maybe they're not interested. Maybe they're just not interested. I mean, even you don't need to go as far as say potentially a more stigmatized situation like say it's transgender or non-binary. You can go even kind of like come to the other side and just talk gender per se, and potentially there might not be a genuine interest to even have this kind of like a fuller gender inclusion. And it's kind of like potentially linked back to my comment to
Grace, yeah.
Grace, around the sort of the austerity and a sense of insecurity that many workers in many organizations feel today, and so they might feel that potentially the EDI might be just one more thing that they cannot prioritize at the moment for whatever reason. So I was just wondering if you had any. It's just it's just like a skeptical comment. Why would they take any of this on board?
Yes, that's a very legitimate comment, and I think that's why it's. I think that's why it's interesting that the results that we have presented also have this part of, if you have more inclusive workplaces, individual workers feel that they can be more productive. So I think it's important to sort of like tell the whole story, right? That if they don't feel that they can be themselves, their productivity suffers. So at the end, it will damage organizations and businesses because it really harms personal, at least how they perceive it, of course, because this is qualitative research based on their own perceptions. But I think that's why it's important to tell that whole story, and we can only hope that that can convince people. Yeah.